Struggle of Russia for Creation of the State, B.D. Grekov I. Two Worlds Division of the World. The chapter begins by describing a world divided into two unequal parts. The first was the territory around the Mediterranean Sea, largely controlled by the Roman Empire. The other was the vast area of Europe inhabited by peoples at a lower stage of development, whom the Romans often called barbarians. The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is depicted as the most culturally advanced part of the world at that time, having united the most cultured portion of humanity. The empire had great military leaders, poets, sculptors, architects, lawyers, and politicians all working to strengthen and embellish the state. Citizenship in Rome was a highly prized status. Barbarian societies. In contrast, the barbarian peoples lived in their own alliances, emphasizing unity within their groups, and were often unaware of the Roman Empire until it appeared with weapons to take them as slaves. These societies are presented as more egalitarian than the Roman state, where one for all and all for one. They were also not as advanced, from the perspective of the Romans, and were generally not familiar with the benefits of a more developed culture. Contact and change. The isolation between these two worlds could not last forever. As the two groups came into more frequent contact, some Romans, particularly those who were disenfranchised, began to see the benefits of the simpler and more just life of the so-called barbarians. Problems with the Roman system. Rome began to recognize the limitations of a slave-based economy. Slaves were unreliable and unproductive, and they sometimes rose up against their Roman masters. This is not necessarily presented as a positive moral development in Roman society, but more from the perspective of Roman self-interest. Roman views of the Slavs. While the Slavs were distant from the Roman Empire, Roman scholars attempted to categorize them. The Roman writer Pliny described the areas up to the Vistula River as inhabited by Sarmatians, Veneti, Syri, and Hiri. Tacitus was unsure whether to classify the Veneti, along with the Peucini and Finns, as Germans or Sarmatians, noting that the Veneti resembled Sarmatians in their customs and character. Ptolemy also mentions the Veneti as one of the large tribes in Sarmatia. These accounts indicate that the Romans had some awareness of the Slavs, but did not have detailed information about them. Shifting perceptions of the Slavs. By the 6th century, the perception of the Slavs changed dramatically. As the Slavs moved closer to and began to encroach on the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire, they were no longer regarded as distant and insignificant. The Slavs began to present themselves as a military threat. The author of the document notes that the Slavs became better fighters than the Romans, amassed great wealth, and were no longer dismissible. Slavic expansion. The text notes that the Slavs began to settle along the Danube River and make frequent incursions into Roman territories. The Slavs caused immense damage, taking Roman strongholds and advancing into the Roman Empire. Slavic military prowess. The Slavs are presented as very skilled with weapons and not easily enslaved. They showed a strong awareness of their own strength and were unwilling to submit to other powers, such as the Avars. The text presents the Slavs as having adopted Roman military techniques and organized into large, effective fighting groups. The Great Migration period. The text refers to this period of history as the Great Migration of Peoples. However, the author notes that this explanation is not fully satisfactory. It raises the question of why the peoples of Europe and Asia had remained in their places for so long before they began to move. The author suggests a need to re-examine the existing understanding of this important period of history. Civilizational shift. The text argues that humanity has experienced several eras of civilization that are defined by their modes of production and their social relations. The chapter describes the ancient world as being based on the exploitation of slave labor. The text makes note of the fact that the Greeks did not consider productive work to be appropriate for free people, and both Plato and Aristotle considered slavery to be normal. Decline of the slave society. The author argues that the so-called barbarian peoples could not ignore the decaying nature of the antique social order based on slave labor. The chapter points to the Greek colony of Olbia as an example of the changes occurring at this time. It uses an example of how Greek colonists started adopting the clothing and customs of the Scythians to suggest that there was a blending of the two worlds at this time. The document argues that this was a widespread process, with the old and dying world mixing with a new, growing world capable of breathing life into the old. The rise of a new religion. It is noted that a new religion was emerging, which offered the promise of a heavenly reward to the working and burdened. This new religion, Christianity, is described as being revolutionary, and as one of the most revolutionary elements in human history. The text notes that this new faith was international, and that its opponents even called it a brazen teaching of barbarians. The role of the barbarians. The text argues that it was the barbarians, rather than the Roman Empire, who laid the foundation for modern Europe. This is because they had a more gentle form of dependence, and these forms gave those in bondage a means of gradual liberation as a class. The text suggests that only barbarians are capable of rejuvenating a world languishing in a dying civilization. Migration of Romans. The chapter also discusses how Romans themselves were fleeing to the barbarians because of the failing system. The text notes that the people of the declining Roman world were ready to trade their homelands for any other land. Common traits. It is noted that the new peoples who filled the medieval era had certain things in common, such as the clan system, the transition of the clan community into rural communities, and the forms of dependence that were strengthening with the development of feudalism. The text also refers to Plato's belief that war between Greeks and barbarians was inevitable, but that Plato did not see the outcome that was to come. Slavic participation in transformation. The Slavs were active participants in the struggle against the slave-based world. Along with other peoples, such as the Germans, Armenians, and Iberians, the Slavs were instrumental in remaking the political map of Europe and Asia, and creating new states from the ruins of the slave-owning world. 2. Early Middle Ages and the first Slavic states' emergence of barbarian states. The chapter opens by discussing the rise of new states on the territory of the former Roman Empire. These states are called barbarian because they were founded not by Roman citizens, but by the new peoples who were once called barbarians by the Romans. These states were built on a new social foundation, and their structures were very different from the states of the ancient world. Inheritance from Rome. These new states inherited much from the Roman world. The first written laws of these new peoples in the Western Empire were recorded in Latin. The Western Christian Church used Latin, seeking to connect its followers to Roman culture. Rome also bequeathed its cities, craftsmanship, and military expertise to its conquerors. Slavic adaptation and innovation. In the eastern part of the former Roman Empire, new peoples, primarily Slavs, also adopted military and technical skills from the old culture, but they retained their own language in state and church practices. Some Slavic groups created their own states in their own territories despite their ancient connections to the ancient world. These achievements were the result of their own labor and development. The Russian state. The text identifies the largest of the Slavic states as the Russian state. Slavic social structure. At the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages, the Slavs had a social structure similar to that of the ancient Germans, Armenians, Iberians, and other new peoples who formed states on a new production basis, with a peasant commune at its core. Wherever the Slavs settled, they brought their communal practices. Challenges in studying Slavic society. The text notes that it is hard to trace the evolution of this communal structure from the sources available. These sources primarily focus on the external aspects of Slavic life, such as military activities, because these were more interesting to outside observers. Additionally, the accounts of foreigners are subject to bias, depending on whether they were friendly or hostile to the Slavs. Foreign perspectives on Slavs. Byzantine and Gothic historians. These writers viewed the Slavs with condescension, despite acknowledging their strength and courage. This attitude is attributed to the fact that the Slavs were at a lower level of cultural development than the Byzantine Empire. Slavic disunity. The Byzantine writer Mauritius believed that the Slavs did not have a single leader and were frequently at war with each other, preventing them from having a strong military organization. However, the text suggests that this view is an oversimplification and that it is important to consider all the details of the sources that are used. Arab perspective. The Arab writer Masudi, writing later, 10th century, stated that the Slavs were so powerful and formidable that, were they not divided into so many tribes and clans, no other nation in the world could compete with them. The text also notes that there is evidence for some early unification of large Slavic groups, and cites the fact that the Gothic historian Jordanes recorded that a large group of Slavs was unified under a single rule as early as the 4th century. Slavic military activity. Despite views of Slavic disunity, the Slavs actively fought against the Byzantine Empire and the Avars during the 6th century. They often had the upper hand, were well organized, and had effective leaders. Some Slavs even served in high positions in the Byzantine army. Slavic influence on Byzantium. The text emphasizes that the Slavs' social structure offered advantages to some parts of the population compared with the Roman one. After the European part of the Eastern Roman Empire disappeared and new Slavic states emerged, the Asian part of the empire was greatly influenced by the influx of Slavs. The Byzantine Empire became Slavicized, in a social sense. By the 8th century, much of Greece was considered Slavic and barbarian. The Byzantine agricultural law of the 8th century shows the prevalence of Slavic-style peasant communes in the Byzantine countryside. Slavic organization and state formation. The text asserts that the Slavs had to organize themselves to achieve their goals and consolidate their victories against the Byzantine Empire. They formed effective armies, capable of defeating the skilled Roman military. The author notes that those writers who referred to the Slavic armies as a crowd were wrong to do so. Slavic alliances and leadership. The text concludes that Byzantium fought not just with separate Slavic tribes, but with larger associations that were led by powerful leaders who respected the decisions of a people's assembly. The text suggests that these associations were a necessary step to deal with their successful military actions. Slavic states. After crossing the Danube and defeating the Eastern Roman Empire, the Slavs had to organize not only for conquest, but also to hold on to what they had won. The text states that this led to the creation of new states, including Bulgaria, which was largely Slavic, despite the involvement of Turkic groups in its founding. By the 7th century, the Serbs were also politically organized, led by a great Zupan, chieftain. The Czech state was also formed during this time. The text notes that the Western Slavs, Czechs, Moravians, Polabians, Pomeranians, Poles, etc., faced challenges due to the eastward expansion of the Germans. The Slavs were also establishing themselves in Dalmatia, Istria, and Thessaly. The impact of Byzantium. The text notes that Byzantium hindered political unification among Slavs close to its borders, using various tactics to sow discord among them. Early attempts at unification. The text notes that the earliest attempts to unite Slavic groups under one rule occurred far from the influence of Byzantium. The case of Russia. The text states that Russia developed far from the direct influence of the Byzantine system. It also notes that some Russian historians have ignored the period before the arrival of the Varangians, when the author believes that the Russian people had already begun to form a state. It is noted that some historians consider the arrival of the Varangians to be the beginning of Russian statehood. However, the text also mentions other historians who trace the history of the Russian people back to the 6th century. One historian in particular, V.O. Klyachevsky, noted that the eastern Slavs of the Carpathian Mountains had a large military alliance led by a prince of the Duleb tribe, and that this alliance was the beginning of Russian history. 3. At the dawn of Russian statehood, challenging the Varangian theory. The chapter questions the traditional view that the Russian state began with the arrival of the Varangians, Vikings, specifically Rurik. It suggests that the Russian people had their own state structures prior to this event. Some historians, such as Karamzin, considered the invitation of the Varangians to be the beginning of the state, but others had more objective views. Alternative perspectives. The chapter highlights historians like Evers, who began the history of the Russian people in the 6th century with the first accounts of the Ontes, and Klyachevsky, who pointed to a large military alliance of Eastern Slavs in the Carpathian Mountains in the 6th century led by a prince of the Dulebs as the beginning of Russian history. Klyachevsky believed this alliance was formed through the struggle with Byzantium and united the Eastern Slavs. The Dulebian Alliance. The text discusses the significance of the Dulebian tribal alliance in the 6th century as a major political force among the Eastern Slavs. Arab sources. The Arab writer Masudi mentioned a powerful Slavic group known as the Volhynians, who were likely the Dulebs. He noted that this group had its own rulers. Chronicle confirmation. This information is also supported by the Tale of Bygone Years, which describes the Dulebs' domination over other Eastern Slavic tribes. Avar invasion. The chronicle also speaks of the Avars' subjugation of the Dulebs. Geographic location. The Dulebs lived along the Bug River, in the area that later became known as Volhynia. Reinterpreting historical sources. The chapter addresses attempts by some historians to link the Dulebs of the Russian chronicles to the Czech Dudleby, arguing that there is strong evidence to support the existence of a powerful East Slavic tribe known as the Dulebs. These scholars argue that the Dulebian narrative in Russian chronicles refers to a Russian tribe, supported by the existence of a proverb mentioned in the chronicles and the frequent use of the term in the Carpathian region. Doubts about early political organizations. The chapter notes that while some historians, like M.S. Hrushevsky, cautiously acknowledged the Duleb's significance, he also questioned the extent and duration of their political system. The significance of the Dulebs. The text maintains that the Dulebs were capable of playing a unifying role based on historical data, and that the record of this period should not be dismissed. The linguistic evidence. The text refers to the work of A. A. Shokhmatov, who states that the shared sound features of the Russian language point to a close unity of the population in their original homeland, and that this unity was based around a tribal center, most likely Volhynia. 3 Slavic states. The chapter mentions that Arab sources from the 9th and 10th centuries describe 3 political unions of Eastern Slavs, existing after the breakup of the Dulebian state, and before the formation of the Kiev state. Quioba. Identified as Kiev, this region was involved in trade with other countries. Slavia. Located further from Bulgaria than Quioba, this region was likely based in the Novgorod area. Artania. Located closer to the Khazars, this region was known for its military strength and its ability to impose tribute on the border regions of the Byzantine Empire. It was closed to foreigners. Some suggest this region was later absorbed by the Khazar state. The importance of these early political structures. The text emphasizes the importance of these pre-Kievan Rus political entities, and that these entities should be either integrated into the history of the Russian people or understood in the context of that history. Marxist perspective. The chapter mentions that Karl Marx believed that there were 2 states, Kiev and Novgorod, that preceded the unified Kiev state under Oleg. Marx considered the Kiev state, with its vast territory, as one of the early medieval states in Europe. Conclusion. The text concludes that in the 6th century there were signs of an early Russian state in the Carpathian region, and that after the breakup of that state, other state formations emerged before the Rurik dynasty. It argues that it is just as impermissible to ignore the sources of this pre-Kievan period as it would be to ignore the history of the Frankish kingdom before the Carolingian dynasty. 4. Social relations of the pre-Kiev and early Kiev periods of Russian history, early social organization. The chapter begins by noting that in the earliest periods, Slavs were organized into tribal communities where each clan had its own territory. These communities were based on kinship and collective living. The text emphasizes that these early Slavs were primarily agriculturalists. Agriculture. The text states that archaeological evidence shows that Eastern Slavs were an agricultural people, cultivating various grains. Early calendar. The agricultural focus is further supported by the ancient Slavic calendar, which was based on agricultural work. Transition from tribal to village communities. The text explains that over time, tribal structures began to give way to village communities, with the family-based communities eventually forming into rural communities. Collective responsibility. The text explains that in this period, there was a system of collective responsibility, where fines were paid by the entire community rather than individuals. Meer and Verve. The text notes that the community was called Meer in the north and Verve in the south. The role of slavery. The text notes that slavery existed in the ancient world, and that this system was perpetuated by wars against the so-called barbarian people, but over time the institution of slavery began to fade. Military democracy. The text explains that in the 6th century there was a period of military democracy, where the entire population was armed and participated in public assemblies. However, this system was temporary, and power became concentrated in the hands of a privileged class. Emergence of social stratification. As society developed, a class system began to emerge, and the text states that by the time of the writing of the earliest version of Russkaya Pravda, which the text dates to about the 8th century, Russian society was no longer egalitarian. The Russkaya Pravda is described as a legal code that protected the interests of the wealthier, more privileged, and armed segments of society. The rise of a landowning elite. By the 10th century, the text notes that land ownership by princes and boyars became common. This development shows the emergence of a landowning elite. Princely holdings. Princes held their own lands and castles, as well as villages. Boyars. Boyars, who were the wealthy and powerful people in the society, also owned land. The text suggests that these boyars had grown from the land, and had not lost their connection to it. Influence of boyars. The text explains that the princes had to consult with the boyars on important political matters due to their significant political influence. Evidence from treaties and charters. The text cites historical documents, such as treaties between Rus and the Greeks, and charters from the period, to show that the princes and boyars were not living at the expense of the prince, but rather from their own lands. Regional differences. The chapter notes that the pace of social and economic development was not uniform across all Eastern Slavic territories, with some regions like the Dulebs, Polans, and Severians being more advanced than others like the Drevlians, Radomics, and Viatics. The territories of the Drevlians, Radomics, and Viatics were later integrated into other political centers. Individual households. Archaeological evidence from Staraya Ladoga suggests that individual households were present in the 8th century, which indicates a move away from communal living toward individual economic units. The persistence of the past. The text mentions that while communal structures were evolving, they continued to leave their mark, and that elements of the old tribal system persisted in later legal documents, like Russkaya Pravda. The text notes that Russkaya Pravda was not designed to create the community, but rather reflected a community that already existed. Conclusion. The chapter concludes that the social structure of the pre-Kievan and early Kievan Rus periods was one of significant change. It was characterized by a move from communal living to the emergence of a land-owning class, and it also describes that while the tribal structure gave way to village communities, elements of the old structure remained. Creation and strengthening of the Kiev state. Its place in Europe and Asia. Foundation of the Kievan state. The chapter emphasizes that the Kievan state did not emerge in a vacuum, but was the result of a long process of development among the Eastern Slavs. The Tale of Bygone Years focuses on the history of the Rurik dynasty, which is why it starts with the calling of the Varangians. However, the text notes that this should not be taken as the beginning of Russian history. Local chronicles. The text mentions that local chronicles existed in major cultural centers like Kiev and Novgorod before the compilation of the Tale of Bygone Years. Pre-Rurik history. The tale omits some details of this earlier history, including the struggle of the Novgorodians under Vadim against Rurik. The author of the tale was interested in portraying Rurik as a positive figure. Rurik's origins. Some Frankish chronicles mention a Rurik as a leader of a Danish naval force in Scandinavia, and the text suggests that this could be the same Rurik of the Russian chronicles. Establishment of the Rurik dynasty. The text explains that Rurik's successor took control of Kiev in 882, establishing the Rurik dynasty, but that this was a process that had been prepared by the prior history of the Eastern Slavs. Integration of Slavs and Varangians. The text argues that the Rurik dynasty quickly assimilated into the Slavic population, adopting their language, religion, and military practices. Slavic military terms. Most military terminology was Slavic, not Varangian. Diverse court. The court of the early Rurik princes was not exclusively Varangian, and included Slavs, Finns, and Turks. Political adaptation. The Rurik dynasty succeeded because it adopted the political program and interests of the Russian state. Territorial expansion. The chapter describes how the Kievan state expanded its territory through the strategic placement of rulers and military campaigns. Oleg's conquests. Oleg, Rurik's successor, systematically placed his men in key cities along the Dnieper River, including Smolensk and Lyubech, with the exception of Kiev, where he installed himself. Kiev as capital. Oleg declared Kiev the mother of Rus cities. Strategic importance of Kiev. Kiev was strategically located on a major trade route, leading to the Black Sea, Byzantium, and Rome. Internal consolidation. The text explains that the Kievan princes worked to unify the state through laws and regulations. Estavliat. The term estavliat, to establish, meant to precisely define and legalize order. The text uses this to explain the development of treaties and laws, like Russkaya Pravda. Military achievements. The chapter emphasizes the military successes of the Kievan state, using these successes as indicators of its power and influence. Integration of tribes. The text notes that Kievan Rus integrated various tribes, including the Drevlians, and that this unification was important for both political and economic stability. Confrontation with the Khazars. Kievan Rus systematically liberated Slavic lands from Khazar control and ultimately destroyed the Khazar state. Black Sea control. Oleg campaigned to liberate the Severians from the Khazars, and he expanded Kievan Rus control to the Black Sea, including the territory of the Uliks and Tivets. Relationships with neighboring powers. Kievan Rus established relationships with several European and Asian states. Byzantine relations. The text details the complex relationship between Kievan Rus and the Byzantine Empire, noting that there were periods of conflict and cooperation. Byzantine treaties. The text mentions treaties between Kievan Rus and Byzantium in 907, 911, 944, and 972, each with unique characteristics. Rus involvement in Byzantine conflicts. The text states that Rus was often involved in Byzantine conflicts with Arabs and Bulgarians. Rus military prowess. Byzantine officials, such as Patriarch Photius, acknowledged the military strength and strategic capabilities of the Rus. Rus as a major power. The text describes that by the first half of the 10th century, Kievan Rus was a major force in international relations. Rus involvement in Byzantine succession. The text explains that in 969, Byzantium sought assistance from Rus against the Bulgarians, but this alliance ultimately led to Rus occupying much of Bulgaria. Rus defeat in Byzantium. Sviatoslav was defeated by the Byzantine Empire in 972, but the battle earned Rus additional recognition for its military power. Conversion to Christianity. Rus converted to Christianity from Byzantium under Vladimir, a move that increased the cultural exchange between the two states. Relations with Poland. The text describes a long-standing and complex relationship between Rus and Poland, characterized by conflict over border regions. Conflict with Poland. Vladimir's conquest of Polish cities like Przemysl and Cherwin in 981 led to a long period of conflict and shifting borders. Rus-German relations. The text mentions that Rus also had a relationship with the Holy Roman Empire, including diplomatic exchanges and marriage alliances. Rus-Papal relations. The text also notes that Rome tried to bring Rus into the Catholic fold, especially during the reign of Iziaslav, who was married to a Catholic. Rus relations with France. The text mentions the marriage of Anna, the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, to the King of France, Henry I, highlighting the widespread connections of the Chivan state. Eastern connections. The chapter notes that Chivan Rus also had strong connections with the East, particularly through the Volga trade route. Volga trade route. This route connected Rus to Persia, India, and other parts of Asia. Cultural exchange. The text states that the Volga route facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, with Eastern architects, missionaries, and cultural practices influencing Rus. Arab interest in Rus. The text notes that Arab geographers and historians were very interested in Eastern Europe and the Slavs. Trade with Muslims. Muslim merchants traded with the Eastern Slavs using currency as early as the 7th century. Interactions with nomadic groups. The text explains that Chivan Rus also had complex relationships with nomadic groups, such as the Pecheneg, Turks, and Polovtsians. Integration and military service. These groups sometimes served as mercenaries for the Rus princes, or became integrated into Chivan society as federates. Toponymic evidence. Many place names in the Rus territory reflect the presence of these nomadic groups. Black Hats. The term Black Hats, Chernai Klobuki, was used to refer to these Turkic groups who had become allies or vassals of the Chivan state. Conclusion. The chapter concludes that Chivan Rus was a powerful, well-organized state that played a significant role in both European and Asian affairs. The state was able to consolidate power, expand its territory, and establish important relationships with diverse cultures and states, while maintaining its own identity.